The sunk cost fallacy. Could this be something that's affecting WWE right now as we speak? After all, it does come into play with everything from business investments all the way to relationships. Well, this very question serves as the perfect topic of this episode, because today... Thank you to all the wonderful supporters out there who support me over on Patreon, like True Sinister and The Reflection of Perfection. To find out how to get your own Patreon shoutout, please go over and check out my Patreon page. Alright, so let's start a discussion. What exactly is the sunk cost fallacy? Well, we'll be getting into that, and we'll also be looking at a particular wrestler and some of his statistics to wonder if maybe he might be a prime example of what the sunk cost fallacy is for WWE. And after that, we're going to open up the floor, that way I can find out what all of you think. But before we do any of that, let's get into defining what the sunk cost fallacy is. The sunk cost fallacy is the phenomenon whereby a person is reluctant to abandon a strategy or course of action because they have invested heavily in it, even when it is clear that abandonment would be more beneficial. For example, let's say you buy yourself a used car, but it turns out to be a total lemon and you can't get your money back. But even though you didn't spend that much money on the car and still have enough to buy another car, or even if you were better off taking public transportation, you still force yourself to drive that jalopy no matter how many times you have to call AAA. The automotive service, not the wrestling promotion. This happens because you internally rationalize that you already spent the money on the car, so you might as well get as much use out of it as possible, even though it's coming to your own detriment. But, as I mentioned earlier, this applies to more than just financial investments, as it also works for relationships too. As another example, sometimes people stay together no matter how miserable they are in a relationship just because they already put a lot of time into it. And in both of these cases, the overall mentality and the overall problem is that people don't like admitting when they're wrong. And sometimes some people feel like by investing time or investing money into something and then walking away from it is admitting that they're wrong. But the trick is that's true whether you walk away or not. Sticking around doesn't make you any more correct. But now that we've talked about both relationships and monetary investment, could all this be what's going on with WWE and Brock Lesnar? In 2022, Brock Lesnar was the highest paid wrestler in the entire industry, making $13.5 million while only wrestling a mere 8 times. And he was also the highest paid wrestler in 2021 as well as 2020 and so on and so forth. But despite this, he's never been a top earner in any of WWE's major money-making categories. Now sure, I'm willing to bet that some of you out there think that Brock Lesnar is so well known because of the UFC or ESPN or whatever, and that brings a lot of mainstream attention to WWE. Now, I've already talked about that and disproven it in another episode, but some lessons bear repeating. Because when we look at Brock Lesnar and count everything dollars to donuts, how much does any of this actually translate to money being brought into WWE? And when you're the highest paid employee, you probably should be able to earn your paycheck. And so, in order to better analyze this, let's watch some TV. When it comes to television ratings and how well Brock draws, it's something of a mixed bag. For instance, when looking at Raw's highest rated episodes of the year so far, some have contained Lesnar and others haven't. Like most recently with the Raw after WrestleMania, which garnered over a healthy 2.26. And Brock Lesnar was a part of the show. However, the Raw that scored over 2 million before that happened on February 20th, and there was no Beast in sight. And while the Raw after Mania did score higher than that February 20th episode, let's remember that it's still the Raw after Mania, so of course it was going to do well. But that February 20th episode was the follow-up to the Elimination Chamber featuring Sami Zayn and the Tribal Chief in the main event. And while the Elimination Chamber might not be anywhere near as big as WrestleMania, the Bloodline story was rocket hot at the time. Therefore, let's take a look at another episode of Raw. Let's go to the 5th most watched episode of the year, which scored over 1.86 million viewers. And this occurred on February 6th. And yes, Brock Lesnar was a part of that. But you notice that this episode didn't even break 2 million even if Brock was on the program. But you know what did? The January 30th episode, which scored over 2.11 million viewers. And for this showing, no Brock Lesnar at all. But you know what? Let's go to the highest rated Raw of the year, which was Raw 30. And yes, Brock Lesnar was there. However, he came in as a surprise at the close of the program. So I'm not sure it's really fair to count him as one of the advertised reasons that kept people watching the show, as I'm sure towards all the other legends and the celebration of 30 years of Raw that got them to tune in the first place. Now, to make things clear, I'm not trying to say that Brock Lesnar is an anti-draw. I don't think his presence makes people change the channel. I'm just saying I don't think he's actively bringing things in. And again, when you're the highest paid wrestler, you probably should be able to do that. But when we look at these ratings, there's no consistent pattern involving Brock, meaning that when more people are tuning in, it has nothing to do with Lesnar. However, that's just television, and there are other metrics we can look at, such as attendance figures. And to better examine that, let's take a look at some of the crowds for WWE pay-per-views, and see if the ones with Lesnar do better than the ones without. But since it won't be fair to compare WrestleMania to Fastlane, let's try to keep them a little more simpatico. Let's start with the Survivor Series. Survivor Series 2022 was held in Boston, Massachusetts, and it had 15,609 fans in attendance. But out of all the people there, Brock Lesnar wasn't one of them. Now, this number was similar to what happened in 2021, where I was one of 15,120 people in attendance in Brooklyn, New York, and yet again Brock Lesnar was not on the card. However, he was a part of the 2019 Survivor Series in Rosemont, Illinois, but that show's crowd was only 13,271 deep. But okay, Survivor Series is just one pay-per-view. Let's take a look at another one that Brock Lesnar has only shown up to sometimes, like the Elimination Chamber. For the Elimination Chamber, this year saw Montreal, Quebec, Canada having 17,271 fans all there live to see the event. And this number is over 2,000 higher than it was for both March 8th, 2020 show in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, as well as February 25th, 2018 show in Paradise, Nevada. And Brock Lesnar was only a part of the Quebec show and not the other two. Okay, so you might have noticed that I skipped over to Saudi Arabia year, but that's because the Saudi shows have a different pattern when it comes to attendance. But with that being said, Canada is a foreign country too, and maybe I shouldn't count that either, even though it is the highest grossing out of the three we looked at, as specific pay-per-views held in Montreal usually tend to do better than the same ones done in the United States. Take for instance probably the most famous Montreal pay-per-view of all time, Survivor Series 1997, home of the Montreal Screwjob, as this show saw over 20,000 people in attendance, which is way higher than the other Survivor Series numbers that I just talked about. But going back to the Elimination Chamber, let's be real here. The real main attraction was the main event, Montreal's own Sami Zayn going against Roman Reigns for the championship, as I'm sure more fans put that match on a higher level than they did for Brock vs. Bobby Round 3. But with that being the case, I do think being the main event does have something to do with this whole equation, and therefore we can start comparing WrestleManias, one where Brock Lesnar is in the main event and the other where he's not. And in order to make things as fair as possible, we're gonna find two WrestleManias that happen in the exact same venue. For WrestleMania 32, which I was also there for, the crowd was over 101,000 people, and its main event had Roman Reigns vs. Triple H. Meanwhile, for WrestleMania 38, which also had Roman Reigns in the main event, but this time he was unifying the titles against Brock Lesnar, Night 2 only had 78,000 despite it being in the exact same arena and it also being a WrestleMania. Okay, so now these numbers aren't looking great for Brock. But we do have to keep in mind that when someone buys a wrestling ticket, they're usually not buying just for one wrestler. They're not buying for just one reason, as there's a multitude of things that get people to go to a show. Although, that doesn't mean that there aren't still some numbers out there that will give us a more specified result, like merchandise sales. Because when it comes to this aspect of the business, we can plainly see who people are supporting specifically. Roman Reigns, Becky Lynch, Bray Wyatt, all of these wrestlers have topped the list when it comes to merchandise sales. And in the last few years, Sami Zayn, Cody Rhodes, and the Usos have all made the top 10. All the while, Brock Lesnar has been nowhere close. And if you suspect that Brock's usual heel status might be affecting his sales, well, just remember that the Tribal Chief is currently leading the way despite being the company's top heel. And if you were thinking that maybe you could argue that Brock Lesnar's part-time status is a factor, well, let's just go to 2021, where Stone Cold Steve Austin was the top merchandise seller for the entire company despite being retired for 19 years. And he was seconded by John Cena. Plus, also in the top 10 for 2021 was The Rock. But again, you know who wasn't? Brock Lesnar. Okay, so now, when we stop to look at all this, I think it's safe to say that Brock Lesnar isn't exactly bringing in the cash. But yet, WWE keeps on going with him time and time again. As this isn't one long contract that Brock Lesnar is working out, they re-sign him continuously. And they keep giving him spots and main events and titles that could easily go to other wrestlers who bring in more money and are there more often. And Lesnar's not the only one, as WWE also does this with Ronda Rousey and Logan Paul. They keep getting re-signed even though they're not bringing in as much as they should be. Also, how about Baron Corbin? Here's a wrestler who won King of the Ring, Money in the Bank, and retired Kurt Angle, but yet no one cares. Although, for the time, it at least seems like WWE is backing off of him. But when it comes to Lesnar, nobody has the amount of equity that WWE has put into him, even though all the money shows that he just doesn't earn his keep. Why are they doing this? Could it be the sunk cost fallacy? Or can you think of another reason why Brock Lesnar and WWE's numbers don't add up? Well, there you have it. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you to my awesome Patreon supporters out there. And if you like being a part of the Thinking Fans channel, then please make sure that you're subscribed and that you give this video a big like. Thank you again for watching, and as always, Dave knows.